The storm raged around them as Michelle Wood pressed herself against the cabin wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the rain-lashed window, she could see Captain Brandon Garcia standing at the helm, his weathered hands gripping the wheel with practiced certainty. The ship groaned beneath another massive wave, and she closed her eyes, remembering how she had come to be here, alone on this vessel with a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. The memory pulled her back, 3 months earlier, to the moment when her world had shattered completely. She had been standing in the parlor of her family's estate, watching as the bailiffs cataloged every piece of furniture, every painting, every remnant of the life she had known. Her father's debts had finally caught up with them, and there would be no mercy from his creditors. The house, the land, everything would be sold to satisfy the mounting bills that had accumulated like storm clouds over their heads. "Miss Wood," the lead bailiff had said, his voice carrying the weight of finality, "you have until tomorrow morning to gather your personal belongings. After that, this property will be sealed pending auction." She had nodded, her throat too tight to speak. 23 years old, and suddenly she had nothing, no family, no fortune, no prospects. Her mother had died when she was 16, and her father had followed her into the grave just 6 months ago, leaving behind only debts and disappointment. The relatives who might have taken her in had made their positions clear through carefully worded letters that spoke of their own financial difficulties and limited space. That night, she had packed a single trunk with her most practical clothing and the few pieces of jewelry her mother had left her. As dawn broke over the estate for the last time, she had walked to the harbor town of Portsmouth, her entire life reduced to what she could carry. The docks had been bustling with activity even in the early morning hours. Merchants shouted prices for their wares, sailors prepared ships for departure, and the salt air carried the promise of distant shores. She had wandered among the vessels, desperate and directionless, when she overheard a conversation between two dock workers. "Captain Garcia is looking for passengers willing to pay passage to the Caribbean," one had said. "His ship leaves with the tide, but he's particular about who he takes aboard." "Aye, and with good reason," the other had replied. "Pirates still prowl those waters, and a man's got to be careful about who he trusts when he's weeks from any safe harbor." Michelle had approached them hesitantly, her remaining coins heavy in her purse. The Caribbean meant opportunity, or so she had heard. Perhaps she could find work as a governess or companion to some merchant family. It was a desperate plan, but desperation had become her closest companion. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. The workers had directed her to a ship called the Meridian's Edge, a sturdy vessel with clean lines and well-maintained rigging. Captain Garcia had been inspecting the cargo manifest when she approached, and she had been struck immediately by his presence. He was a man in his early 40s, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples, and eyes the color of storm clouds. His clothing was simple but well-made, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Captain Garcia," she had said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I understand you might have passage available to the Caribbean." He had looked up from his papers, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her desperation. "Passage isn't cheap, miss, and it's not a pleasure cruise. We'll be at sea for weeks, and there's no guarantee of safety once we reach those waters." "I can pay," she had replied, though the words felt hollow. She could pay, but barely, and once she reached her destination, she would have almost nothing left. "Can you?" His tone had been neutral, but she sensed he was measuring more than just her financial resources. "What's your business in the Caribbean, if you don't mind my asking?" She had hesitated, unwilling to admit the full extent of her circumstances to this stranger. "I'm seeking new opportunities, a fresh start." Something in his expression had shifted then, a flicker of understanding that made her wonder what he saw in her face. "A fresh start," he had repeated quietly. "I know something about those myself." He had quoted her a price that would take nearly all her remaining money, but she had agreed without hesitation. What choice did she have? The alternative was destitution in a country that held nothing but painful memories. The first weeks of the voyage had passed in relative calm. The Meridian's Edge was a merchant vessel carrying goods and a handful of passengers to various ports throughout the Caribbean. Michelle had kept largely to herself, spending her days reading in her small cabin or walking the deck when the weather permitted. Captain Garcia had been polite but distant, treating her with the same professional courtesy he showed all his passengers. She had begun to relax, to believe that perhaps this journey would be uneventful. The other passengers were a mix of merchants and adventurers, all focused on their own affairs and destinations. The crew seemed competent and disciplined, and the ship made good time through favorable winds. It was during the third week that everything changed. Michelle had been standing at the rail, watching dolphins play in the ship's wake, when she heard the lookout's cry from the crow's nest. "Sail ho! 3 points off the starboard bow!" The reaction was immediate and telling. The crew moved with sudden urgency, and she could see tension ripple across the deck like a physical thing. Captain Garcia appeared beside her so quickly she hadn't seen him approach. "Miss Wood," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need you to go to your cabin and stay there until I tell you otherwise." "What's happening?" she asked, though the fear in the crew's faces was already providing the answer. "Probably nothing," he replied, but his eyes were fixed on the distant sail. "Just a precaution." She had retreated to her cabin as instructed, but the small porthole gave her a view of the approaching vessel. As it drew closer, her blood ran cold. The ship was flying no flag, and its dark hull cut through the water with predatory grace. Even from a distance, she could see armed men crowding its deck. Pirates. The word echoed in her mind like a death knell. She had heard stories, of course, tales of ships taken and passengers killed, or worse. The Caribbean was notorious for such encounters, and despite the increased naval patrols, pirates still operated with frightening boldness in these waters. The next hour passed in agonizing tension. She could hear shouted orders from the deck above, the sound of the crew preparing for what seemed inevitable. The Meridian's Edge was well armed for a merchant vessel, but against a ship full of desperate men with nothing to lose, their chances seemed slim. When the attack came, it was swift and brutal. The pirate ship closed the distance with remarkable speed, and Michelle pressed herself against the cabin wall as the sound of cannon fire shattered the afternoon calm. The Meridian's Edge shuddered under the impact, and she could hear splintering wood and shouted curses from above. The battle was fierce but brief. Captain Garcia and his crew fought with courage and skill, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. When the pirates finally boarded, the deck became a chaos of clashing steel and desperate combat. Michelle had huddled in her cabin, praying that she might somehow remain hidden, but it was a futile hope. The door burst open, and 2 rough-looking men entered, their weapons drawn and their eyes gleaming with the promise of plunder. "Well, well," one of them had said, his voice thick with an accent she couldn't place. "What have we here?" They had dragged her from the cabin despite her struggles, hauling her onto a deck that was now slick with blood and littered with debris. The sight that greeted her was devastating. Several of Captain Garcia's crew lay motionless, while the survivors knelt under guard, their hands bound behind their backs. Captain Garcia himself stood near the mainmast, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, but his bearing still proud and defiant. His eyes found hers across the deck, and she saw something there that might have been regret or determination, or perhaps both. The pirate captain was a man named Justin Wright, a notorious figure whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his cunning. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with fair hair and cold blue eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw in terms of potential value. "Captain Garcia," Wright had said, his voice carrying a mockingly formal tone, "I must say you've provided us with quite an interesting cargo manifest." He had gestured toward Michelle, and she felt her blood freeze as his gaze settled on her. "Tell me, what's a fine lady like this doing aboard a merchant vessel bound for such dangerous waters?" Garcia's jaw had tightened, but he said nothing. Wright had circled closer to Michelle, studying her like a buyer examining livestock. "You know," Wright continued conversationally, "there's quite a market for well-bred English ladies in certain ports. Some of my associates have very specific tastes, and they pay handsomely for quality merchandise." The implications of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had heard whispers of such things, Stories that respectable people didn't discuss in polite company. The thought of what awaited her made her legs weak with terror. "She's under my protection," Garcia had said quietly, and something in his tone made Wright turn to face him fully. "Your protection?" Wright laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Captain, I'm afraid you're in no position to protect anyone. Your ship is taken, your crew defeated, and your cargo now belongs to me." "The lady is not cargo," Garcia replied, his voice steady despite his circumstances. Wright's expression had grown dangerous. "Everything on this ship belongs to me now, including her, unless, of course, you'd like to make some sort of arrangement." The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Michelle had ever witnessed. Captain Garcia, even in defeat, possessed a quiet authority that seemed to unsettle the pirate captain. Wright clearly wanted to assert his dominance, but something about Garcia made him proceed more cautiously than his usual reputation suggested. "I have gold," Garcia had said simply, "hidden where your men will never find it. Enough to buy passage for the lady and safe conduct to the nearest British port." Wright's eyes had gleamed with interest, but his expression remained skeptical. "And why would I trust the word of a defeated enemy? What's to stop me from taking your gold and keeping the lady as well?" "Because you're not a fool," Garcia replied. "You know that gold hidden by a desperate man stays hidden unless that man chooses to reveal it. Kill me or betray our agreement, and you'll never see a single coin." The standoff stretched for long minutes, the only sounds the creaking of the ship's rigging and the distant cry of seabirds. Michelle found herself holding her breath, terrified that Wright would reject the offer and carry out his original threat. Finally, Wright had nodded slowly. "Very well, Captain, but the terms are mine to set. You'll remain as my guest until I'm satisfied with the value of your hidden treasure. The lady will be treated as a passenger under my protection, but she stays aboard my ship where I can ensure her safety." The words had been carefully chosen, but Michelle understood the real meaning. She would be a hostage, insurance against Garcia's cooperation and honesty. The thought of boarding a pirate vessel filled her with dread, but the alternative was far worse. The transfer had taken place immediately. Wright's crew had efficiently stripped the Meridian's edge of anything valuable while Garcia was escorted aboard the pirate ship. Michelle had been given a few minutes to gather her belongings, her hands shaking as she packed her trunk under the watchful eyes of her captors. As they prepared to leave the merchant vessel, she had looked back at Garcia's crew, the survivors still kneeling on the blood-stained deck. Wright had noticed her gaze and smiled coldly. "Don't worry about them, miss. They'll be set adrift in the ship's boats with enough supplies to reach the nearest island. Whether they make it or not depends on their seamanship and luck." It was a cruel mercy, but mercy nonetheless. Many pirates would have simply killed the survivors to eliminate witnesses. That Wright chose otherwise suggested either pragmatism or a twisted sense of honor. The pirate ship, called the Crimson Tide, was larger and more heavily armed than the Meridian's Edge. Its crew was a mix of nationalities and backgrounds, united only by their chosen profession and loyalty to their captain. Michelle had been assigned a cabin that was surprisingly clean and well-appointed, though she noticed the heavy lock on the outside of the door. "You'll find everything you need," Wright had told her as he showed her to the quarters. "Food will be brought to you, and you're welcome to walk the deck during daylight hours, accompanied by one of my men, of course." The days that followed had been a strange mixture of terror and tedium. True to his word, Wright had treated her with formal courtesy, ensuring she was fed and comfortable. But she was never allowed to forget her status as a prisoner, and the constant presence of guards made any thought of escape impossible. Captain Garcia had been housed in a cabin near the stern, and she caught glimpses of him occasionally when she was permitted her daily walks. He always nodded politely when their eyes met, but they were never allowed to speak. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he regretted his decision to try to protect her. The Crimson Tide made excellent time through the Caribbean waters, and Wright proved to be a skilled navigator. They avoided the main shipping lanes where naval patrols might be encountered, instead following routes that took them past uninhabited islands and through channels known only to those who made their living outside the law. It was during her second week aboard the pirate vessel that Michelle began to understand the true nature of her situation. Wright had been drinking heavily one evening, and his usual careful courtesy had given way to something more sinister. He had cornered her on deck during her evening walk, dismissing her guard with a casual wave. "You know, Miss Wood," he had said, his words slightly slurred, "I've been giving considerable thought to your future." She had tried to step away, but he had moved to block her path. The smell of rum on his breath made her stomach turn, and she could see a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "Captain Garcia's gold is all very well," Wright continued, "but I'm beginning to think you might be worth more than whatever treasure he's promised. There are men in Port Royal who would pay handsomely for a woman of your breeding and beauty." The threat was clear, and Michelle felt panic rising in her chest. "You gave your word," she managed to say. "You promised safe passage." Wright had laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "I promised many things, my dear, but circumstances change, and a wise man adapts to new opportunities." He had reached out as if to touch her face, and she had recoiled instinctively. The movement seemed to amuse him, and he had stepped closer, trapping her against the ship's rail. "Don't worry," he had whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "I'll make sure you're well prepared for your new life. My crew knows how to break in difficult women." The words had struck her like physical blows, and she felt her knees weaken with terror. But before Wright could act on his threat, a voice cut through the evening air like a blade. "Captain Wright!" They had turned to see Captain Garcia standing a few feet away, flanked by two of Wright's men who looked uncertain about their orders. Garcia's expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes that made Wright step back from Michelle. "Captain Garcia," Wright said, his tone becoming carefully neutral, "I wasn't expecting to see you on deck this evening." "I requested permission to speak with you," Garcia replied evenly, "about the location of my gold." Wright's attention had shifted immediately, his predatory focus on Michelle temporarily forgotten. "Ah yes, I was beginning to wonder when you might be ready to discuss that particular matter." Garcia had glanced at Michelle, and she saw something pass across his features, a flicker of concern or determination. "Perhaps we could speak privately, captain to captain." The suggestion had clearly appealed to Wright's ego, and he had nodded magnanimously. "Of course. Miss Wood, please return to your cabin. We wouldn't want you to be disturbed by tedious business discussions." She had fled gratefully, her heart still racing from the encounter. As she reached her cabin, she could hear the two captains moving toward Wright's quarters, their voices fading into the night sounds of the ship. The next morning had brought a dramatic change in Wright's behavior toward her. Gone was the leering predator of the previous evening, replaced by his earlier formal courtesy. He had even apologized for his conduct, blaming the rum and the stress of command for his inappropriate behavior. Michelle had been suspicious of the sudden transformation, but she was grateful for the reprieve. Whatever Garcia had said or promised during their private meeting had clearly had the desired effect. She found herself wondering what price he had paid for her continued safety. The answer had come 3 days later when she overheard a conversation between two of Wright's crew members. They had been discussing the captain's plans, unaware that she was within earshot during her supervised walk. "He's decided to keep the other captain aboard permanently," one had said. "Seems Garcia knows these waters better than most. And the captain thinks he might be useful for future ventures." "What about the gold he promised?" the other had asked. "Oh, he's already delivered on that, turned over a fortune in Spanish coins and jewelry. But Wright's got bigger plans now. Thinks Garcia might be convinced to join us properly, given enough time and the right incentives." The implications had chilled Michelle to the bone. Garcia had bought her safety by essentially trading his freedom, and now Wright was planning to force him into permanent service as a pirate. The thought of the honorable sea captain being corrupted by Wright's influence filled her with unexpected anguish. That evening, as she sat in her cabin trying to process this information, she heard a commotion from the deck above, shouting voices, running feet, and the unmistakable sound of the ship changing course rapidly. She pressed her ear to the cabin wall, trying to understand what was happening. The door to her cabin opened suddenly, and one of Wright's men entered, his face grim with urgency. "Miss, the captain wants you on deck immediately. Bring nothing but what you're wearing." She had followed him topside to find the ship in controlled chaos. The crew was working frantically to adjust the sails, and Wright stood at the helm with a spyglass pressed to his eye. In the distance, she could see the distinctive silhouette of a naval frigate, its British colors clearly visible even at this distance. "How long until they reach us?" Wright shouted to his lookout. "2 hours, maybe less if the wind holds," came the reply. Wright had lowered his spyglass and turned to Garcia, who stood nearby under guard. "Well, Captain, it seems your Navy friends have found us after all. I don't suppose you'd care to explain how they knew where to look?" Garcia's expression remained impassive. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Captain Wright. I've been your prisoner for weeks." "Indeed you have," Wright replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Still, it's a remarkable coincidence that a British warship should appear in these particular waters at this particular time." The standoff between the two men was interrupted by another shout from the lookout. "Captain, there's another sail to the northeast. Looks like a sloop of war." Wright's face had gone pale as he raised his spyglass again. Michelle could see his hands trembling slightly as he studied the approaching vessels. Two British warships converging on their position meant that escape would be nearly impossible. "Damn, Wright muttered, then raised his voice to address his crew. "All hands, prepare for action. We'll not go quietly to the gallows." The next hour had passed in frantic preparation. The Crimson Tide was well armed, but against two naval vessels with professional crews and superior firepower, their chances were slim. Wright seemed to understand this, but his pride and desperation drove him to prepare for a fight rather than surrender. Michelle had been ordered back to her cabin, but the thin walls provided little protection from the sounds of preparation for battle. She could hear the crew loading cannons, sharpening weapons, and making their peace with whatever gods they favored. When the first shots were fired, the sound was deafening. The naval vessels had approached from different angles, making it impossible for the pirates to concentrate their fire effectively. The Crimson Tide shuddered under the impact of naval cannon fire, and Michelle was thrown against the cabin wall as the ship lurched violently. The battle had raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. The pirates fought with the desperation of men who knew that capture meant the gallows, but they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. One by one, the Crimson Tide's cannons fell silent, either destroyed by enemy fire or abandoned by their crews. When the end came, it was swift and decisive. The larger frigate had maneuvered alongside the pirate vessel, and Michelle could hear the sound of grappling hooks and boarding parties. The clash of steel and the cries of wounded men filled the air, punctuated by the authoritative voices of British officers restoring order. She had huddled in her cabin, terrified and uncertain of what her rescue might mean. Would the naval officers believe her story? Would they see her as a victim or an accomplice? The uncertainty was almost as frightening as her captivity had been. The door to her cabin had finally opened to reveal a young British lieutenant, his uniform pristine despite the recent battle. "Miss Wood, I presume," he had said politely. "Lieutenant Joshua Ramos of His Majesty's ship Intrepid. You're safe now, madam." The relief had been overwhelming, and she found herself unable to speak for several moments. Lieutenant Ramos had waited patiently, his expression kind and understanding. "Captain Garcia?" she had finally managed to ask. "Safe and well, miss. He's speaking with our captain now. It seems we have him to thank for finding you." The revelation had stunned her. Somehow, despite being a prisoner himself, Garcia had managed to get word to the British Navy about their location. The how of it remained a mystery, but the result was undeniable. She had been escorted to the frigate Intrepid, where she was given a clean cabin and treated with the utmost courtesy. The ship's surgeon had examined her and pronounced her in good health despite her ordeal, and the captain's steward had provided her with proper clothing to replace her travel-worn garments. Captain Justin Johnson of the Intrepid was a distinguished officer in his 50s, with the bearing of a man accustomed to command and the wisdom that came from long years at sea. He had received her in his cabin with formal politeness, but she could see the questions in his eyes. "Miss Wood," he had begun carefully, "I hope you understand that I must ask you some questions about your experiences. The Admiralty will require a full report, and your testimony will be crucial in the prosecution of the pirates we've captured." She had nodded, understanding the necessity even as she dreaded reliving the ordeal. "Of course, Captain Johnson. I'll tell you everything I can remember." The interview had been thorough but not unkind. Captain Johnson had listened to her account with professional attention, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When she finished, he had leaned back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. A remarkable tale, Miss Wood. You've shown considerable courage in the face of very trying circumstances. I don't feel courageous, Captain, she had replied honestly. I feel fortunate to be alive. Indeed you should. Captain Wright has a reputation for ruthlessness that makes your survival something of a miracle. He had paused, studying her face. Tell me, what are your plans now? Do you have family or connections in the Caribbean? The question had brought her back to the reality of her situation. Her rescue from the pirates had been wonderful, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem that had driven her to seek passage in the first place. She was still alone in the world, still without resources or prospects. I'm afraid not, Captain, she had admitted. I was hoping to find employment, perhaps as a governess or a companion to a merchant family. Captain Johnson had nodded thoughtfully. I see. Well, we'll be putting into Port Royal within the week. I'm sure we can find someone to assist you in locating suitable employment. The conversation had been interrupted by a knock on the cabin door. At Captain Johnson's invitation, Captain Garcia had entered, and Michelle felt her heart skip at the sight of him. He looked tired but unharmed, and his clothes had been cleaned and mended since the battle. Captain Garcia, Johnson had said warmly, please join us. I was just discussing Miss Wood's future plans. Garcia had bowed politely to Michelle before taking the offered chair. I hope you are recovering well from your ordeal, Miss Wood. Thanks to you, Captain Garcia, she had replied, meaning every word. Lieutenant Ramos tells me that we have you to thank for our rescue. Garcia had looked uncomfortable with the praise. I merely did what any gentleman would do under the circumstances. Nonsense, Captain Johnson had interjected. Getting word to us required considerable ingenuity and no small amount of risk. Wright's crew would have killed you if they'd discovered what you were doing. The story had emerged gradually over the following days as the Intrepid sailed toward Port Royal. Garcia had indeed managed to communicate their location to the British Navy using a combination of coded messages, hidden in seemingly innocent requests, and the assistance of one of Wright's crew members who had grown disillusioned with the pirate life. The crew member, a young man named William King who had been pressed into service against his will, had been looking for an opportunity to escape Wright's ship. Garcia had recognized his desperation and carefully cultivated his trust, eventually convincing him to carry messages to British contacts in various ports. It had been a dangerous game that required patience, cunning, and considerable courage. One wrong move would have meant death for both men, but Garcia had persisted, driven by his determination to protect Michelle and see justice done. The revelation of his sacrifice had affected Michelle profoundly. Here was a man who had risked everything for her safety, asking nothing in return and expecting no recognition for his actions. It was a nobility of character that she had rarely encountered in her sheltered life. As the days passed during their voyage to Port Royal, she found herself seeking out Garcia's company whenever possible. They would walk the deck together in the evenings, talking about books, philosophy, and their experiences at sea. She discovered that beneath his quiet exterior lay a sharp intellect and a dry sense of humor that emerged when he felt comfortable. Garcia, for his part, seemed to enjoy their conversations as much as she did. He told her stories of his years at sea, the ports he had visited, and the people he had met. His experiences had given him a perspective on life that was both worldly and philosophical, and Michelle found herself hanging on his every word. It was during one of these evening walks that she learned more about his background. He had been born in Spain, but had spent most of his adult life sailing under various flags, always as a legitimate merchant captain. His reputation for honesty and competence had made him welcome in ports throughout the Caribbean and Mediterranean. I've never married, he had told her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The sea has been my mistress, demanding and jealous. It seemed unfair to ask a woman to compete with such a rival. The comment had been made lightly, but Michelle sensed deeper currents beneath his words. Here was a man who had chosen solitude, perhaps out of necessity or perhaps out of fear of the vulnerability that love required. Do you ever regret that choice? She had asked quietly. He had been silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the horizon. I used to think I didn't, but recent events have made me reconsider many things about my life. The conversation had been interrupted by the appearance of Lieutenant Ramos, who had come to inform them that Port Royal was visible on the horizon. The news should have filled Michelle with relief, but instead she felt a strange sense of loss. Once they reached port, this interlude would end, and she would have to face the uncertain future that awaited her. Port Royal had been everything she had expected and more. The notorious pirate haven had been transformed in recent years into a legitimate trading port, but traces of its lawless past still lingered in the narrow streets and weathered buildings. The harbor bustled with activity as merchants, sailors, and officials went about their business under the watchful eyes of British authorities. Captain Johnson had been as good as his word, introducing Michelle to several respectable families who might have need of a governess or companion. The prospects were not entirely promising, but they offered hope for eventual employment and independence. Garcia had his own business to attend to in port. The loss of his ship and cargo represented a significant financial setback, and he needed to meet with various merchants and insurers to assess his options. Michelle had watched him prepare for these meetings with a mixture of admiration and concern, knowing that his future was as uncertain as her own. On their third day in port, she had been sitting in the parlor of Mrs. Jennifer Scott, a merchant's widow who was considering hiring a companion, when a commotion in the street drew her attention to the window. A crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an official announcement being read by a town crier. "What's all that noise about?" Mrs. Scott had asked irritably, clearly annoyed by the interruption to their interview. Michelle had excused herself and stepped outside to investigate. The announcement concerned the trial of Captain Wright and his surviving crew members, who were to be tried for piracy, murder, and various other crimes. The proceedings would begin the following week, and witnesses were being called to testify. The news had filled her with dread. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of having to face Wright again, even in a courtroom, made her stomach churn with anxiety. The thought of recounting her experiences in public, of having her ordeal dissected and examined by lawyers and judges, was almost overwhelming. That evening, she had sought out Garcia at the inn where he was staying. She found him in the common room, studying a letter with a frown of concentration. When he saw her approach, his expression brightened, but she could see the concern in his eyes as he noted her distressed state. "Miss Wood," he said, rising to greet her, "you look troubled. Has something happened?" She had explained about the trial announcement and her fears about testifying. Garcia had listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as she spoke. "I understand your concerns," he had said when she finished. "Facing Wright again will be difficult, but your testimony is crucial to ensuring that justice is done. These men have terrorized innocent people for years, and your account could help put an end to their crimes." "I know you're right," she had replied, "but I'm not sure I have the strength for it. Every time I think about that man and what he threatened to do, I feel sick with fear." Garcia had reached across the table and gently covered her hand with his own. The gesture was simple but profoundly comforting, and she felt some of her anxiety begin to ease. "You have more strength than you realize, Michelle Guetti," he had said, using her given name for the first time. "You survived weeks as a prisoner, maintained your dignity in the face of terrible threats, and emerged with your spirit intact. That takes a courage that many people never discover they possess." The sincerity in his voice and the warmth of his touch had moved her deeply. In that moment, she realized that her feelings for this man had evolved far beyond gratitude or admiration. She was falling in love with him, and the knowledge was both thrilling and terrifying. The trial had indeed been an ordeal, but Garcia's words had given her the strength to endure it. She had testified clearly and completely, describing her capture, imprisonment, and the threats made against her. Wright had glared at her from the dock, but his malevolent presence no longer held the power to paralyze her with fear. Garcia's testimony had been equally damning, detailing Wright's crimes and the conditions aboard the pirate ship. His calm, authoritative manner had clearly impressed the court, and his account had provided crucial corroboration for Michelle's testimony. The trial had lasted 3 days, and the verdict had been swift and decisive. Wright and his surviving crew members were found guilty on all charges and sentenced to hang. The sentence would be carried out within the week, bringing an end to one of the Caribbean's most notorious pirate careers. After the trial, Michelle had felt a strange sense of closure. The ordeal was finally over, and she could begin to look forward rather than backward. But the future still held many uncertainties, not least of which concerned her growing feelings for Captain Garcia. She had been walking along the harbor front, trying to sort through her emotions, when she encountered Garcia himself. He had been standing at the end of a pier, looking out at the ships anchored in the harbor, and there was something in his posture that suggested deep contemplation. "Captain Garcia," she had called softly, not wanting to startle him. He had turned at her voice, and she was struck by the sadness in his expression. "Michelle," he had said, "I was hoping I might see you before I left." "Left?" The word had hit her like a physical blow. "You're leaving Port Royal?" "Tomorrow, on the morning tide," he had confirmed. "I've secured passage on a merchant vessel bound for New York. There are opportunities there for a man in my situation, and I need to rebuild my life and career." The news should not have surprised her, but it felt like a betrayal nonetheless. Just when she was beginning to hope that their relationship might develop into something deeper, he was preparing to leave her behind. "I see," she had managed to say, though her voice sounded hollow to her own ears. "Well, I wish you every success in your new endeavors." Garcia had studied her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. "Michelle, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said weeks ago." She had waited, her heart hammering against her ribs, afraid to hope and afraid to despair. "When I first saw you on the docks in Portsmouth, desperate and alone, I saw something in you that reminded me of myself at a difficult time in my own life. I wanted to help you, to give you the chance for a fresh start that I had once needed myself." He had paused, seeming to struggle with his words, but somewhere during our ordeal my feelings changed. "You ceased to be simply a passenger in need of protection and became something far more precious to me." The confession had taken her breath away. She had hoped, but hearing the words spoken aloud was more powerful than she had imagined possible. "Brandon," she had said, using his given name for the first time, "I feel the same way. These past weeks have shown me a side of life I never knew existed. And you've been at the center of all of it." He had stepped closer, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. "That's exactly why I have to leave, Michelle. You deserve better than a man whose life is built on uncertainty and risk. You deserve stability, security, a home where you can build the kind of life you were meant to live." "Don't I get to decide what I deserve?" she had asked, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Don't I get to choose what kind of life I want to build?" The question had seemed to catch him off guard, and she pressed her advantage. "You talk about stability and security as if they're the most important things in the world. But I've learned something these past months. I've learned that a life without risk is a life without growth, without discovery, without the possibility of real joy." She had reached out and taken his hands in hers, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard work and the strength that had protected her when she needed it most. "I don't want a safe, predictable life, Brandon. I want a life filled with purpose and adventure and love. I want to see the world through your eyes, to share in your experiences, to be your partner in whatever comes next." Garcia had stared at her for a long moment, and she could see the battle between his protective instincts and his own desires playing out across his features. "Michelle," he had said finally, "what you're suggesting would mean giving up any chance of the conventional life you were raised to expect. Life at sea or in foreign ports, or wherever my work might take us, it's not easy. There would be hardships, dangers, uncertainties that most women never have to face." "Most women never have the opportunity to face them," she had corrected. "Most women are told from birth that they're too delicate, too precious, too important as symbols of respectability to risk themselves in the real world. But I've seen what I'm capable of when circumstances demand it, and I'm not afraid of a challenging life if it's a meaningful one." The conviction in her own voice had surprised her. Months ago, she had been a sheltered young woman whose greatest concern was maintaining her family's social standing. Now she was proposing to throw away every conventional expectation in favor of an uncertain but authentic future. Garcia had lifted their joined hands and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that sent warmth racing through her entire body. "Are you certain, Michelle Tweetball? Once we take this step, there will be no going back to the world you knew. You'll be choosing a path that will set you apart from everything you were raised to value. I'm choosing you, she had replied simply. Everything else is just details. The kiss that followed had been worth every moment of uncertainty and fear she had endured. It was gentle and passionate, tentative and confident, a perfect expression of the complex emotions that had been building between them for weeks. When they finally broke apart, Garcia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I never thought I would find someone who could understand this life, who could choose it willingly and with full knowledge of what it means. I never thought I would find someone worth choosing it for, she had replied. But they had spent the rest of the evening walking through Port Royal, talking about their plans and dreams. Garcia had contacts in New York who might help him secure a new ship and cargo, and from there the possibilities were endless. The Caribbean, the Mediterranean, the Orient, all the exotic destinations that had been mere names on maps could become their reality. The practical arrangements had been surprisingly straightforward. Michelle's few remaining possessions could be easily transported, and her lack of family ties, which had once seemed like a curse, now felt like a liberation. There would be no tearful farewells, no family obligations to complicate their departure. They had married 3 days later in a simple ceremony conducted by the port chaplain, with Captain Johnson and Lieutenant Ramos serving as witnesses. It had been nothing like the elaborate society wedding Michelle had once imagined for herself, but it had been perfect in its sincerity and significance. Mrs. Scott, the merchant's widow who had been considering hiring Michelle as a companion, had been scandalized by the news. She had made her disapproval clear in a series of pointed comments about young women who threw away their reputations for romantic notions. Mark my words, girl, she had said during their final meeting, you'll regret this foolishness within a year. The sea is no place for a lady, and pirates aren't the only dangers you'll face in that life. Michelle had listened politely but remained unmoved by the warnings. She had already faced pirates and survived, had already discovered strengths within herself that she hadn't known existed. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with Brandon at her side. The morning of their departure had been crisp and clear, with favorable winds filling the sails of the merchant vessel that would carry them to New York. As Port Royal fell away behind them, Michelle had stood at the rail with her husband, watching the Caribbean islands fade into the distance. Any regrets? Brandon had asked, slipping his arm around her waist. None, she had replied, and meant it completely. The voyage to New York had been their true honeymoon, a time of discovery and deepening intimacy as they adjusted to their new relationship. Michelle had thrown herself into learning about shipboard life, and Brandon had been a patient teacher, showing her the intricacies of navigation, weather reading, and cargo management. She had also begun to understand the business side of his work, the complex relationships between merchants, shippers, and port authorities that made international trade possible. It was a world far removed from the drawing rooms and social calls of her former life, but she found it infinitely more engaging. Their arrival in New York had marked the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. The bustling port city was unlike anything Michelle had experienced, a melting pot of nationalities and cultures united by the common pursuit of commerce and opportunity. Brandon's contacts had proved valuable, and within a month he had secured backing for a new vessel, a sleek brigantine called the Aurora's Promise. The ship was smaller than the Meridian's Edge, but faster and more maneuverable, perfect for the kind of specialized cargo runs that commanded premium prices. Michelle had insisted on being involved in every aspect of the business, from selecting crew members to negotiating contracts with merchants. Her education, which had once seemed useless in practical terms, proved invaluable in managing correspondence and maintaining the detailed records that successful trading required. Their first voyage together had been to Charleston, carrying manufactured goods south and returning with cotton and tobacco. It had been a routine run, but for Michelle, it had been a revelation. She had finally found her place in the world, not as an ornament or dependent, but as a full partner in a meaningful enterprise. The months that followed had brought new challenges and adventures. They had weathered storms that tested both their seamanship and their marriage, navigated political tensions between various Caribbean islands, and built a reputation for reliability and integrity that brought them increasingly profitable contracts. Michelle had also discovered that she had a natural aptitude for languages, picking up Spanish and French from their diverse crew and the merchants they dealt with in various ports. This skill had proved invaluable in negotiations and had helped establish the trust that was essential in international trade. But it was not just the professional aspects of their new life that fulfilled her. The personal relationship between her and Brandon had deepened into something richer and more complex than she had ever imagined possible. They were partners in every sense of the word, sharing not just the work, but the dreams and fears that drove them forward. One evening, as they sailed through calm seas toward Barbados, Michelle had been standing at the bow, watching dolphins play in the phosphorescent wake. Brandon had joined her, slipping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about, he had asked softly. "About how different my life is now from what I thought it would be," she had replied. "6 months ago, I was convinced that my world had ended. I couldn't see any future worth having. And now?" She had leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth of his body. "Now I can't imagine any other life. This feels like what I was always meant to do, who I was always meant to be. Even when the storms come and the cargo shifts, and we're not sure we'll make port before the food runs out." She had laughed, remembering their recent adventure when a navigation error had left them becalmed for 3 days with dwindling supplies. Especially then. Those are the moments when we find out what we're really made of. Brandon had tightened his embrace, and she could hear the smile in his voice when he spoke. "I love you, Michelle Garcia. Not just for your courage or your intelligence or your beauty, but for the way you've embraced this life completely. You've made me understand what partnership really means." "I love you too," she had replied, turning in his arms to face him. "Thank you for giving me the chance to discover who I really am." The kiss they shared had been sweet and passionate, a reaffirmation of the bond that had grown between them through shared dangers and discoveries. Around them, the Aurora's promise had cut smoothly through the Caribbean waters, carrying them toward whatever adventures awaited. As the months turned into years, their business had prospered, and their relationship had continued to deepen. They had faced storms both literal and metaphorical, had navigated political upheavals and economic uncertainties, had built a network of friends and associates throughout the Caribbean and beyond. Michelle had also discovered that she was pregnant, news that had filled them both with joy and anticipation. The thought of raising children in this unconventional life had initially concerned her, but she had come to realize that their children would grow up with advantages that no conventional upbringing could provide. They would be citizens of the world, comfortable with diversity and change, equipped with the skills and confidence to create their own paths in life. Now, as she stood in their cabin aboard the Aurora's Promise, feeling their first child move within her, Michelle reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The storm outside was fierce, but she felt no fear. Brandon was at the helm, their crew was experienced and loyal, and their ship was sound. They would weather this storm as they had weathered all the others, together. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had once been told she was alone and had nothing, now had everything that truly mattered. She had a partner who valued her as an equal, work that challenged and fulfilled her, and a future bright with possibilities. A knock at the cabin door interrupted her reverie. "Michelle," Brandon called, "the storm's passing. Would you like to come up and see the sunrise?" She smiled, placing her hand on her growing belly. "We'll be right there," she called back, speaking to both her husband and their unborn child. As she climbed the companionway to the deck, Michelle marveled at how completely her life had been transformed. The frightened, desperate young woman who had sought passage on a merchant ship seemed like a stranger now, someone she had known long ago but could barely remember being. The deck was still wet from the storm, but the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and pink. Brandon stood at the wheel, his hair tousled by the wind and his eyes bright with the satisfaction of having successfully navigated them through another challenge. "Beautiful morning," he said as she joined him, slipping his free arm around her waist. "Beautiful life," she replied, looking out at the endless expanse of ocean that had become their home and their highway to adventure. Behind them, their crew was already at work, adjusting sails and checking rigging, preparing for whatever the day might bring. Ahead lay the port of Kingston, where new cargo and new opportunities awaited. And beyond that, the vast world of possibilities that they would explore together. Michelle Wood Garcia smiled as she felt her child stir within her, as if eager to join them in this life of adventure and discovery. The future stretched before them like the ocean itself, vast and sometimes dangerous, but always full of promise for those brave enough to embrace it. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last remnants of the storm clouds and revealing a sea that sparkled like scattered diamonds. The Aurora's promise cut through the gentle swells with graceful efficiency, her sails full of the trade winds that would carry them safely to port. Michelle watched their crew work with the practiced coordination that came from months of sailing together. There was Ashley Smith, their navigator, a sharp-eyed woman from Bermuda who could read the stars like a book and whose calculations had never once led them astray. William King, the former pirate crew member who had helped Brandon get word to the British Navy, had proven himself an able seaman and had become one of their most trusted hands. The crew also included Sandra Gonzalez, a cook whose skills with limited ingredients had kept them well fed through long voyages, and several other experienced sailors who had joined them as word of their fair treatment and reliable pay had spread through the maritime community. It was a diverse group united by their shared commitment to honest work and mutual respect. "Land ho!" came the cry from the crow's nest, and Michelle shielded her eyes to peer toward the horizon. The mountains of Jamaica were just visible in the distance, their peaks wreathed in the morning mist that would soon burn away under the tropical sun. "Right on schedule," Brandon said with satisfaction. "We should be tied up at the wharf by noon, with plenty of time to unload and arrange for our next cargo." Michelle nodded, her mind already turning to the business that awaited them in Kingston. They were carrying a mixed cargo of manufactured goods from New York, fine fabrics and tools that would command good prices in the Caribbean market. Their return cargo would likely include sugar, rum, and tropical fruits that were in high demand in the northern ports. But more than the immediate business, she was thinking about the letter that had been waiting for them at their last port of call. It had been from Captain Johnson, now promoted to Admiral and stationed in London, congratulating them on their success and extending an invitation to consider carrying some special cargo for the Crown. The offer had been intriguing but vague, speaking of items of particular value to His Majesty's interests, and compensation commensurate with the discretion required. It was the kind of proposition that could either be very profitable or very dangerous, and they would need to consider it carefully. "What do you think about Admiral Johnson's proposal?" she asked Brandon as they drew closer to the harbor. Brandon was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the approaching coastline. "It's an honor to be considered for such work," he said finally, "but it would also be a significant risk. Carrying government cargo makes you a target for anyone with grievances against the Crown. On the other hand," Michelle pointed out, "it would also give us the protection of the Royal Navy when needed, and the compensation he mentioned could allow us to expand our operations significantly." "True," Brandon agreed. "What does your instinct tell you?" It was a question he often asked her, and she had learned to trust the inner voice that had guided her through so many challenges. She closed her eyes, feeling the motion of the ship beneath her feet and the warmth of the Caribbean sun on her face. "I think we should at least hear what he has to offer," she said. "We've built our reputation on being reliable and discreet. If the Crown wants to trust us with sensitive cargo, it suggests they have confidence in our abilities." Brandon smiled, and she could see the excitement in his eyes that always appeared when they were contemplating a new challenge. "Then we'll arrange to meet with his representative when we reach Kingston, but we'll be very careful about what we commit to." The harbor of Kingston was as busy as always, filled with ships of every description. Merchant vessels like their own shared the water with naval frigates, local fishing boats, and the occasional private yacht belonging to wealthy plantation owners. The docks bustled with activity as cargo was loaded and unloaded, and the air was filled with the shouts of stevedores and the calls of merchants hawking their wares. Brandon guided the Aurora's promise to their assigned berth with the skill of long practice, and Michelle marveled again at how naturally this life had come to her. The complex dance of bringing a ship safely to port, the negotiations with dock workers and customs officials, the careful inspection of cargo to ensure nothing had been damaged during the voyage, all of it felt as natural as breathing now. As their crew began the process of unloading, Michelle made her way to the harbor master's office to handle the paperwork required for their arrival. It was routine business, but she had learned that attention to such details was essential for maintaining their reputation and avoiding unnecessary delays. The harbor master, a rotund man named Joshua Ramos, who shared a surname but no relation with the naval lieutenant they had known, greeted her with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "Mrs. Garcia," he said warmly, "always a pleasure to see the Aurora's promise in our harbor. I trust your voyage was uneventful?" "Mostly," Michelle replied, signing the necessary documents. "We encountered a storm yesterday evening, but nothing we couldn't handle." "Excellent, excellent. I have a message for you, by the way. A gentleman from the governor's office was asking after your arrival. Said it was a matter of some importance." Michelle felt a flutter of excitement. This could be connected to Admiral Johnson's proposal, the opportunity they had been discussing. Did he leave his name or any indication of what he wanted to discuss? "A Mr. Justin Johnson, I believe. Said he would call on you at your usual lodgings this evening, if that was convenient." The name was unfamiliar, but that wasn't unusual in their line of work. They often dealt with agents and representatives rather than principals, especially when sensitive matters were involved. "Please send word that we would be happy to meet with him," Michelle said. "We'll be staying at the Merchant's Rest, as usual." With the formalities completed, she returned to the ship to find that the unloading was proceeding smoothly. Brandon was supervising the careful handling of their more delicate cargo, while Ashley Smith was already making inquiries about return freight. "Any luck with potential cargo?" Michelle asked as she joined them. "Several possibilities," Ashley replied. "There's a plantation owner who needs machinery transported to Barbados, and a merchant with a shipment of fine rum bound for Boston. Both would pay well, but we'd need to make a decision quickly." "Let's see what our evening visitor has to offer first," Michelle suggested. "It might influence our choice of destination." The afternoon passed quickly as they completed their business in port. Their cargo was sold at favorable prices, and they had several offers for return freight that would ensure the voyage remained profitable, regardless of what other opportunities might arise. As evening approached, Michelle and Brandon made their way to the Merchant's Rest, a comfortable inn that catered to sea captains and traders. It was a place where business was often conducted over dinner, and the proprietor was accustomed to providing private dining rooms for sensitive discussions. Mr. Justin Johnson arrived precisely at the appointed time, a tall, well-dressed man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His manner was polite but reserved, and Michelle sensed that he was carefully assessing them even as they were evaluating him. "Captain and Mrs. Garcia," he said as they were introduced, "thank you for agreeing to meet with me on such short notice. I represent certain interests that may have need of your services." They settled into a private dining room, and Johnson waited until they had been served and the door closed before continuing. "I understand that you have been recommended to us as individuals of exceptional discretion and reliability." "We try to conduct our business with integrity," Brandon replied carefully. "May I ask who provided this recommendation?" "Admiral Johnson, among others," came the reply. "Your actions during the Wright affair brought you to the attention of certain government officials who value competence and trustworthiness." Michelle exchanged a glance with Brandon. This was indeed connected to the Admiral's letter, though apparently the matter was being handled through intermediaries rather than official naval channels. "What kind of services might you require?" Michelle asked. Johnson leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private. "We have need of a vessel and crew capable of transporting certain items between Caribbean ports without attracting undue attention. The cargo would be valuable but not particularly bulky, and absolute discretion would be essential." "What kind of items?" Brandon pressed. "We don't engage in anything illegal, regardless of the compensation offered." "Nothing illegal," Johnson assured them quickly, "but items whose movement might be of interest to various parties who don't necessarily have Britain's best interest at heart. Let's say that certain intelligence regarding French and Spanish activities in the region needs to be shared between our various outposts." The explanation made sense. The Caribbean was a hotbed of international rivalry, with various European powers competing for influence and advantage. Intelligence gathering and sharing would be crucial for maintaining British interests in the region. "What would be the risks involved?" Michelle asked practically. Minimal if handled properly, Johnson replied. The items would be disguised as ordinary trade goods, and your regular commercial activities would provide perfect cover for the operation. However, if the true nature of the cargo were discovered by hostile parties, there could be serious consequences. Such as, Brandon inquired, imprisonment, confiscation of your vessel, possibly worse if you were perceived as spies rather than simple couriers. The risks were significant, but not necessarily greater than those they faced in their normal operations. Pirates, storms, and commercial disputes all pose threats to their livelihood and safety. What sort of compensation are we discussing? Michelle asked. Johnson smiled for the first time since their meeting began. Substantially more than you would earn from normal freight operations. Plus, you would have the gratitude of His Majesty's government, which could prove valuable in various ways. They spent the next hour discussing details, routes, and procedures. The work would involve carrying sealed packages between various British outposts, sometimes combined with legitimate cargo runs, and sometimes as dedicated missions. The packages would be small enough to hide among their regular trade goods, and they would be provided with special documentation to help them avoid problems with customs officials. We'll need time to consider this proposal, Brandon said finally. It represents a significant change in the nature of our operations. Of course, Johnson agreed, but I would appreciate an answer within the next few days. Time is somewhat pressing in these matters. After Johnson left, Michelle and Brandon remained in the dining room, discussing the implications of what they had been offered. It was an opportunity that could significantly increase their income and establish valuable connections with government officials, but it would also expose them to new kinds of danger. What do you think? Brandon asked, echoing the question he had posed that morning. Michelle considered carefully before answering. I think it's a natural extension of what we're already doing. We're already carrying valuable cargo through dangerous waters, dealing with customs officials and port authorities, maintaining discretion about our client's business. This would just add another layer to those activities. The risks are real, though, Brandon pointed out. If we're caught carrying intelligence materials, we could be treated as spies rather than merchants. True, but the same could be said if we were caught carrying gold or other valuable cargo by pirates, Michelle countered. The nature of the risk is different, but the level might not be significantly higher. They talked late into the evening, weighing the pros and cons, considering the impact on their crew and their future plans. Finally, as the inn grew quiet around them, they reached a decision. We'll do it, Brandon said, but we'll be very careful about which missions we accept and how we handle them. Agreed, Michelle said. And we'll make sure our crew understands the additional risks, even if we can't tell them all the details. The next morning, they sent word to Johnson that they were interested in proceeding. Within hours, they received their first assignment, a package to be delivered to the British garrison on Antigua, combined with a legitimate cargo run that would provide perfect cover for the mission. As they prepared the Aurora's promise for departure, Michelle felt the familiar thrill of anticipation that came with starting a new voyage. But this time, there was an additional element of excitement. They were no longer just merchants carrying goods from port to port. They were playing a small but significant role in the great game of international politics. The package they were to carry was sealed and unremarkable, hidden among their legitimate cargo in a way that would escape casual inspection. Their crew had been told only that they were carrying some items for government officials, which was true enough without revealing the sensitive nature of their mission. As Kingston Harbor fell away behind them, Michelle stood beside Brandon at the helm, watching the familiar coastline recede into the distance. Their child moved within her, as if sensing the beginning of another adventure, and she smiled at the thought of the stories she would someday tell about these voyages. Any second thoughts? Brandon asked, noticing her contemplative mood. None, she replied firmly. We've built something good together, Brandon. A life that matters, work that makes a difference. A partnership that makes us both stronger than we could be alone. Even with a baby on the way and new dangers to face? She placed her hand on her growing belly, feeling the strong kick of their child. Especially with a baby on the way. I want our children to grow up knowing that their parents stood for something, that we didn't just exist but truly lived. The Aurora's promise caught the trade winds and began to pick up speed, her bow cutting cleanly through the Caribbean swells. Around them, the crew worked with quiet efficiency, adjusting sails and checking rigging as they settled into the rhythm of another voyage. Michelle looked ahead toward the horizon where Antigua waited, their destination and their first step into this new phase of their lives. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of promise, challenging but rich with opportunity. She had come so far from the desperate young woman who had sought passage from Portsmouth all those months ago. That woman had been running from a life that had collapsed around her, seeking nothing more than survival. Now she was sailing toward a future she was actively creating, a partner in every sense of the word in building something meaningful and lasting. The pirate captain who had once threatened her was long dead, executed for his crimes. But in a strange way, she was almost grateful for the ordeal he had put her through. Without that trial by fire, she might never have discovered her own strength, never have found the courage to embrace the unconventional life that had brought her such fulfillment. As the sun climbed higher and the Aurora's promise settled into her course, Michelle felt a deep sense of contentment wash over her. She was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the right person beside her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together as equals and partners in the grand adventure of their shared life. The voyage to Antigua proved uneventful, which was exactly what they had hoped for on their first intelligence mission. The package was delivered without incident to a nondescript office near the harbor, and their legitimate cargo of manufactured goods found ready buyers among the local merchants. Within 3 days, they were ready to depart with a return cargo of sugar and molasses bound for Charleston. As they prepared to leave Antigua, Michelle reflected on how smoothly their first covert operation had proceeded. The additional income from the government work would allow them to expand their operations sooner than they had originally planned, perhaps even purchase a second vessel within the next year. But more than the financial benefits, she was excited by the sense that their work now served a larger purpose. They were still merchants, still focused on building a profitable business, but they were also contributing to something bigger than themselves. In their small way, they were helping to maintain the stability and security that allowed honest trade to flourish. The return voyage to Charleston gave them time to discuss their future plans in detail. With a baby coming, they would need to make some adjustments to their lifestyle, but neither of them was willing to give up the sea entirely. Instead, they began planning for shorter voyages during Michelle's final months of pregnancy, with longer expeditions resuming after the child was old enough to travel safely. "I've been thinking about names," Michelle said one evening as they sat on deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Oh," Brandon replied, settling back against the cabin wall with his arm around her shoulders. "For a boy, I was thinking perhaps James, after my father. Despite his faults, he did love me in his way, even if he wasn't very good at managing his affairs." "James Garcia," Brandon mused. "It has a good sound to it. And for a girl?" "I was considering Elena, after your mother. You've told me so many stories about her strength and wisdom." Brandon was quiet for a moment, and she could see the emotion in his eyes. His mother had died when he was young, but her memory had clearly shaped his character in profound ways. "She would have loved you," he said finally. "She always said that the right woman would be a partner, not just a wife, someone who could stand beside a man as an equal, sharing both the work and the rewards." "I think I would have liked her too," Michelle replied. "Any woman who raised a son like you must have been remarkable." Their conversation was interrupted by Ashley Smith, who approached with the evening's navigation report. "We're making excellent time, Captain," she reported. "If the wind holds, we should reach Charleston a full day ahead of schedule." "Excellent," Brandon replied. "Any signs of other vessels?" "A few sails on the horizon, but nothing close enough to be of concern. The lookouts are maintaining their watch, of course." After Ashley departed, Michelle and Brandon returned to their comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the Aurora's promise cut through the gentle swells. The ship felt like home now in a way that no building ever had, a place where they were truly themselves and free to pursue their dreams. The successful completion of their first intelligence mission had opened new possibilities for their future. Johnson had already hinted at additional assignments, and the network of contacts they were developing could prove valuable in their regular commercial activities as well. But perhaps most importantly, The experience had confirmed that they could adapt to new challenges while maintaining the partnership that was at the heart of their success. Whether they were facing pirates, storms, or the subtle dangers of international espionage, they were stronger together than either could be alone. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Michelle felt their child move within her, a gentle reminder of the new life they were creating together. Soon they would be a family in the fullest sense, bound not just by love and shared dreams, but by the responsibility of raising the next generation. She thought about the world they would show their children, the lessons they would teach about courage, integrity, and the importance of choosing one's own path. Their children would grow up knowing that life offered infinite possibilities to those brave enough to seize them, that love was not just an emotion, but a commitment to stand together against whatever challenges might arise. The Aurora's Promise sailed on through the Caribbean night, carrying them toward Charleston and the next chapter of their adventure. Behind them, the lights of Antigua had long since disappeared below the horizon. Ahead lay the vast expanse of ocean and sky, beautiful and dangerous, and full of promise. Michelle Garcia smiled as she felt her husband's arm tighten around her shoulders and their child stir within her womb. She had found everything she had never dared to hope for: love, partnership, purpose, and the freedom to write her own story across the endless pages of the sea. The frightened young woman who had once been told she was alone and had nothing was gone forever, replaced by someone who had discovered that true wealth lay not in what one possessed, but in what one was willing to risk for the things that truly mattered. And as the Aurora's Promise carried them toward whatever adventures awaited, Michelle knew with absolute certainty that she had chosen well.